My name is Carolyn Tanner. I'm coming to you from Ottawa, Ontario, and the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin peoples. My background is that I'm a human rights lawyer, and I've worked in that capacity supporting governments in East Timor, Nepal, Uganda, and most recently through this initiative in Thailand. And my area of expertise is really around human rights and using human rights as a leverage and a tool to create equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace. And I look forward to our conversation today. Thanks very much, Morag. It's really nice to be here today. And it's nice to be here because I'm fresh on my arrival back from Thailand. I just spent a week last week working with the Department of Rights and Liberties Protection within the Ministry of Justice to really explore and examine how they can create an action plan to promote equality and inclusion for members of the LGBTQI+ community in their workforce. And I think this is really an important element to be bringing to discussions around gender equality, because I think when we're talking about gender equality, we need to be moving away from a binary discussion of gender, of it being male and female. And it's very important to be including recognition of protections and work against discrimination and towards equality for people because of their gender identity, because of their gender expression, or because of sex characteristics. So this was a really important and interesting initiative. And I think it's particularly interesting because in my view, Canada is one of the leaders in terms of the legislative framework that we have to protect people's gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and sex characteristics from discrimination. So from our charter to the Canadian Code of Human Rights to the Ontario Human Rights Code, all of these things very specifically enumerate and provide protection from discrimination based on sex, and specifically go on to expand that includes gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And our courts have reinforced that. So I think when we go to other contexts, we really go from a place of a country, Canada, that has taken and applied best practices and best human rights practices in terms of protections for people who are gender diverse. And I think it's really great to be able to bring that to a different context. So this is also particularly exciting. And I think what's really positive is that it was demand driven. So it's in response to a request from the government in Thailand, which means there's really political will to try to move this. And what's different in Thailand from Canada is that their legislative framework doesn't provide the same strength of protection. So it's really about looking at the context that they have there, capitalizing on the political will that exists within the Department of Rights and Liberties Protection in the Ministry of Justice, and figuring out a way forward that will work within their context, but that will also provide maximum benefit and be able to leverage the engagement for maximum sustainability over time. So essentially, the approach that I took was to take a human rights-based approach to the work. And for me, a human rights-based approach is really looking at equality and non-discrimination, looking at participation and inclusion, and accountability and transparency. So it was really looking at the processes that exist within the Department of Rights and Liberties and examining them through those lenses. And I think what's interesting is the discussion in Canada around, I'll call it idea work, so inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility. The discussion around that is really quite advanced. But I think what is really nice in the discussion is a very simple kind of picture of three intersecting circles in a Venn diagram where you have equity in one circle, and you have diversity in another circle, and you have inclusion in another circle. And where all three of those intersect, you achieve belonging. And belonging is really what the application of human rights principles is all about. It's about affording each person dignity and each person respect and each person the ability to engage in the workforce in a way where they don't experience discrimination and they ultimately experience belonging. So my approach to the work was to look at it from an equity perspective. And for me, equity is about the rules we put in place to create an equal playing field for people. And I think Tracy spoke about this a little bit earlier, right? So it's about putting in place rules that might intentionally remove barriers that some people might experience because of their identity, because of their gender expression, because of their gender identity, because of their sex characteristics. And then if we look at diversity, it's a fact. So it's about looking at whether or not we currently have a diverse workforce. And by a diverse workforce, I mean looking at things like, do we have a diversity of experiences, a diversity of identities, and a diversity of people within the workforce? And then we look at inclusion, and inclusion is really about the action. So what actions is the organization taking to create a space for people to actively engage and actively have a voice and actively be included in decisions that impact on them and the greater environment? So we might have equity and diversity together, but without inclusion, without an action to intentionally include people in the process, we're not achieving belonging. And we might have inclusion and we might have diversity, but without rules that ensure that the voice can get to the table, we're not achieving belonging. We might have rules and we might have actions, but without diverse voices at the table, we're not getting a diversity of perspectives influencing how we achieve belonging. So really, when I was working with my colleagues at the Ministry of Justice, I brought that perspective in and we looked at their systems. We looked at currently directives that they have in writing. We looked at practices they have in place. We looked at ways that we might be able to try to identify, get a snapshot of the existing diversity of their workforce. And we tried to examine and identify what barriers might be in place currently that we could sort of look to overcome. And we did that a few ways. I think one of the principal concepts of moving forward with work like this is to really ensure that the people who are most impacted have a voice. So together with my colleagues at the Ministry of Justice, we set up a meeting where employees who identified as members of the LGBTQI+ community could come in and share their experiences. And they did that and they were quite open. But I also recognize that within an employment setting, it's difficult to be really open. So we also looked at existing research from the World Bank and from UNDP that indicated that there is a perception amongst the workforce in Thailand that members of the LGBTQI+ community do experience discrimination, and in particular, members of the transgender community. So I thought that was interesting. And then to try to get a more open perspective, we also went and met with civil society organizations that are working particularly on matters of advancement for rights and equality for members of the LGBTQI+ community, and we heard their perspectives. And right now we're in the process of pulling together those perspectives, looking at the barriers that were identified, looking at existing practices, and identifying concrete changes that can be made by the Ministry of Justice now, in the medium term and in the long term, to kind of promote and improve inclusion within the workplace. And I should have said this right at the start. In fact, within that department at the Ministry of Justice, there is an amazing sense of social inclusion, but it's not protected in writing. It's not protected by formal directives. It's not protected by the legislative framework. and it relies very much on individual personalities of people in management. So the question is really, how do we preserve that culture and ensure its sustainability over time? And the goal for the Department of Rights and Liberties Protection is really to model best practice in their department, and then have that practice be measured and monitored over time. So that's how we're getting into the transparency and accountability piece. And then have it rolled out to the subnational government and to other departments in other ministries who see how the positive impact it's having. And this is really nice because the Department of Rights and Liberties Protection currently has responsibility for having written and just recently launched the second National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, which specifically talks about the business community taking steps against discrimination based on sex and based on gender identity. And then it also had responsibility for launching recently the 5th National Action Plan on Human Rights in general. So they really are thought leaders within the country, and I think it's a great opportunity for them to model best practice. It has enormous potential impact moving forward. And I think some of that impact is to really kind of, from the bottom up, push legislation and push the government to take a more intentional view of anti-discrimination laws and a more intentional interpretation of the word sex in Thai, to include, as Canada does, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. So one thing we are doing with the department is encouraging them to define the Thai word for sex, to specifically say this includes, our interpretation of this includes protection from discrimination based on gender identity, and then use a definition of what that is because it's not a familiar term in Thailand, gender expression, and sex characteristics. And what that does is it starts modeling a uniform and expansive approach to protections and ensuring that the framework that they're applying in their day-to-day work models what could be done in other places. It's also an interesting initiative because this department has the mandate to comment on revisions to laws that are being adjusted or amended within the Thai government, and it also has the mandate to implement new laws. So we're working with the legal department as well to develop some guidelines for them and priorities for advocacy so that the advocacy they're doing from the inside out will also be promoting a wider change across the government. I don't really have a lot more to add right here. I think it's important to acknowledge that an action plan is just a plan. Right? Yeah. It's not something that is done. It's more like a promise.
It's a starting point, not an ending point.
Right. So the real challenge here is to ensure that what I'm proposing isn't best practice in Canada, but is something that's really feasible and possible in the Thai context, and is something that is realistic. And I think we can aim for perfection, but the goal isn't really to have something that is aspirational, but more to have something that is practical and guided by Canadian experience. And I think part of that is also interpreting and anticipating barriers that may be put up against the action plan and helping the national government to anticipate how they can respond to that. And one really useful way really was to talk to them about the competing rights framework that the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Ontario Human Rights Commission has used to kind of navigate that space when people start to push back against equality based on gender identity and gender expression because, for example, of religious beliefs. And it's about giving them a framework to be able to navigate those types of conversations so that they can very carefully get to a place where they're able to back up and justify why it's so very important to be fighting for gender equality, not just for men and women, but for gender diverse people across the country.